Hey everyone, it's Mikki here. You're listening to Wikipedia, and this week on the podcast, I speak to returning guest, Dr. Philip Prins. Philip and I discuss his latest study that has pretty much just been published, investigating the role of carbohydrate in endurance performance. We discuss the obligate role that we think carbohydrate plays, but also what is the real purpose of taking carbohydrate whilst training and whilst racing. And the most recent study with Philip and his co-authors, including Andrew Koutnik and Tim Noakes and Dom D'Agostino, really highlights or really challenges the notion that we all need at least 60 grams of carbohydrate, if not upwards of 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrate to improve performance. So Philip and I go into that and the rationale why. We talk about the crossover point with regards to fat oxidation and carbohydrate oxidation. We discuss what I did in my ultra and of course what Hubster did as well. And we talk in broad terms, if you like, about fueling for the athlete, and particularly endurance athlete. And we talk about health implications too. So those of you may remember that Philip was on the show in September 2023, and I'll pop a link to his earlier podcast where we also talked about a range of studies, including higher intensity exercise for ketogenic athletes. And so we talked a lot about the studies that were running there and the metabolic health aspect too. Dr. Philip Prins is an associate professor of exercise science, and he earned a Bachelor of Science in Kinesiology, as well as an MS in exercise science from Georgia Southern University, and a Ph.D. in exercise physiology from the University of Pittsburgh. His research focuses on, amongst other things, the practical impact of lifestyle on metabolism and how metabolism impacts health, disease, and performance outcomes. So, among his many areas of interest and expertise, nutritional ketosis, metabolic responses to exercise, and sports nutrition. And I have put links to, in addition to that previous podcast, where you can find Philip at his university and also his ResearchGate, which has his profile and other papers and the study in question that we're discussing today. I'd like to remind you, though, before we jump on into the conversation, that the best way to support this podcast
Philip,
is to
thank
hit
you
the
so
subscribe
much for
button
taking
on
time
your
to
favourite
speak to me
podcast
this
listening
morning.
platform.
Super excited
that
because, of
increases
course,
the visibility
our previous
out there
conversation
of
was
Wikipedia
based
and amongst
around
literally
sort of
thousands
health
of other
markers
podcasts.
and
So
metabolic
more people
markers
get the opportunity
associated
to listen to the
with
guests that I have on the
triathletes
show, like
and
Dr.
the
Philip
potential
Prins.
impact
All
of
right,
a
team,
higher
you
carbohydrate
enjoy this conversation.
approach for some of them. And of course, now you've just recently published with your co-authors a paper that looked at the different amounts of carbohydrate and I guess what they do during exercise, which is what I am really excited to talk to you about today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
What I will say, actually, I just did an ultra run last week. It was 264 kilometers over sort of 7 days, and
Okay.
you can imagine there are a variety of like fueling strategies that people use. Like there are about 80 of us, and I would say that probably Hubster and I were on the lower carb range. We were taking in probably about 25 grams of carbs an hour, running for about so between 3.5 to 13 hours a day. And what I noticed actually was probably in the latter part of the week, I felt like I needed a little bit more carbohydrate than what I did at the start of the week, which I don't know, whether that is something which you would expect given the different pools of sort of fuel that we've got on the body, or
Yeah. No, that's an interesting observation, and obviously there's what was the reason you decided to go with such a low amount?
Well, it wasn't I suppose it sounds weird because of course I'm a nutritionist, so you would have thought I had a plan, but we were like, well, what do we normally take when we're out training? And normally I do something like goo chomps. I have a gel or half a gel and then another half of the gel maybe 20 minutes later, just because it's easier in my stomach to sort of titrate it in. And actually, to your question, from a lot of what I've been looking at, I suppose, sort of thought leaders in this space, is that what we want to do is titrate in amounts of carbohydrate to prevent hypoglycemia, which is because I've seen Prof. Noakes, who was one of your co-authors, talk about that quite a bit over the last maybe couple of years. And so I guess that was probably one of the rationales, which is why we weren't slamming down 90 grams of carbs an hour. And also I was thinking, how is my gut going to handle that, like a higher intake of carbohydrate for many, many hours across the course of the event? And I didn't think that it would. And then finally, we had like a weight limit. So there wasn't like, we had to really think about our food intake and what we were actually able to take.
It's very interesting. Because I mean, I'm assuming most of your competitors were probably ingesting much larger, right, and much higher amounts. I mean, that's obviously the dogmatic view, right, within the field of exercise science and sports nutrition is that, obviously carbohydrate is the preferred substrate and fuel, and you have to ingest a lot of them before exercise, and obviously also during exercise, after exercise, etc. Right? And if you look at the more latest sports nutrition guidelines, right, is usually somewhere between about 60, 90, up to 120, right, grams of carbohydrate that needs to be ingested during exercise because of this idea that it is going to spare your muscle glycogen.
And is that actually the case? Does it spare muscle glycogen?
There is evidence that paradoxically that no, it does not. So it's yes. So it is very interesting, right? So this notion that you have to ingest, right? Obviously, especially for endurance athletes, such a large amount of carbohydrates during exercise, again, based upon this belief, right, that muscle glycogen is essential. It is obligatory, right, in terms of exercise performance. And once your muscle glycogen, right, hits a certain level, right, becomes depleted, hits a very low level, right, then you're going to bonk, you're going to hit the wall, right, so to speak. And so therefore, right, you want to maintain high rates of carbohydrate oxidation during exercise, and you want to spare your muscle glycogen. And so, therefore, the strategy, right, to ingest such large amounts during exercise. However, like I said, right, could it potentially? Is there any evidence that suggests that it could be sped up? And
Yes.
there is. There's a study by Holy and colleagues where they looked at, again, it was endurance exercise. It was like 70% VO2 max for about a 2-hour duration, and subjects either ingested, I think it was like 120 grams of carbohydrates per hour. So again, a very large amount, or just a placebo, so nothing. And again, there's metabolic effects of ingesting such large amounts, right, during exercise. So number one, right, their rates of fat oxidation fell quite significantly. I mean, when they were ingesting or just on the placebo condition, their rates of fat oxidation was closer to about 1 gram per minute. When they're ingesting this large amount of carbohydrate during exercise, it was like, 0.2 or less than 0.2 grams per minute. So very low rates of fat oxidation. The metabolic effect of that, right, is on the placebo, right, using a decent amount of fat for fuel during exercise. But now by ingesting such a large amount of carbohydrate, now you have to switch, right? So where's the energy, coming from at that point, right? So now you have very high rates of carbohydrate oxidation taking place. And very interestingly, right, so in that study, if you compare, right, muscle glycogen usage between the placebo and the carbohydrate condition, muscle glycogen usage was 70% higher with the carbohydrate ingestion compared to the placebo. So like I said, it is paradoxical. We've been telling athletes, right, that this strategy, right, is going to spare your muscle glycogen, but evidence that this strategy can actually speed up muscle glycogen usage.
And is that because fat oxidation is suppressed so much that we then have to turn to this stored carbohydrate? Oh, interesting. And did it make a difference, Philip? And I don't know if because I don't even have questions about this on the little questions that I sent you through, so I know this is off the top of your head. But do we know what type of typical diet that these athletes consumed in the Hawley study, or actually does it not matter? Are we going to see this whether or not it is an athlete who may be more fat adapted, for want of a better term, if there is one, versus just a standard sort of carbohydrate fueled athlete?
So that study, like the vast majority of all the other studies, right, in this field, right, athletes are ingesting their habitual diet being some kind of moderate or high carbohydrate based diet. So, and again, I would just add to that. Obviously, when you do that, right, the outcome, whether it's pre-exercise or obviously also during exercise, the effect is still somewhat similar, right? I mean, and you see it in all the studies. I mean, all the studies that we have done, most of the studies that we have done, right, is the pre-exercise diet is either high in carbohydrate or low in carbohydrate. Does it have a metabolic effect? Of course it does, right? So obviously, the athletes who are consuming lower carbohydrate diets, they have high or very high rates of fat oxidation, but low rates of carbohydrate oxidation, right? And then it's the opposite, right? For when they switch over to the high carb diet, now their rates of fat oxidation plummet, and their rates of carbohydrate oxidation is higher. So yes, the pre-exercise diet results in that, but then obviously, depending on what is being ingested during exercise, obviously has the carbohydrate that is being ingested, the amount that's being ingested is going to have potent metabolic effects as well. And so, yes, obviously, if you're doing the recommended amounts, 60, 90, 120, absolutely. I mean, the insulin spike that comes with that, right, is going to significantly, right, impair lipolysis and fat oxidation, which, if you look at our study, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that here in a little bit, it was a very small amount. It was only 10 grams. So that's why I was interested in. So during your ultra, you're doing 25 grams, right, per hour. Now we didn't study 25 grams per hour, but something very similar to that, right, at only about 10 grams per hour. So what we found there, I mean, the 10 grams per hour had there was a reason that was chosen. I mean, I piloted that extensively to make sure that it had very, very minimal metabolic effects during exercise.
Okay.
And probably the same thing with you as well. But now as you start going up, you'll see greater and greater metabolic effects with carbohydrate and fat oxidation rates.
Okay, so this is a real 101 question, and absolutely we're going to get back through to sort of what you found with your study, and we're going to go into that in detail. But is there an insulin spike during exercise?
Yes, I mean we haven't measured that, but you can imagine, right? Absolutely. If I'm ingesting, let's say, 10 grams of some kind of carbohydrate source, and usually the most of the carbohydrate sources, right? Maltodextrin, sucrose, glucose, etc., right? Is going to have that, a glucose a spike, an excursion, right, followed by obviously some kind of insulin elevation as well. So absolutely, you're going to see that happening to a much greater extent, right? If I was ingesting, right, 60, 90, 120 versus just 10.
Yeah, no,
or
that
something
makes
similar to that. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess the other thing with the ultra endurance sort of space, like I feel like there hasn't been a lot of research on that sort of 6, 7, 8, 9 hours of activity. A lot of the endurance or sort of long duration tends to sort of top out at 2 or 3 when we're thinking about the studies that really inform some of these sort of guidelines. I mean, there are more case studies looking at ultra marathoners, and I do know that there are some super elite ultra marathoners who do manage 90 grams of carbs an hour over 8 or 9 hours, and but I also think that they themselves are very good athletes. Like, there's just something special about them to be able to sort of really perform high at their sport compared to me, who's just a middle-aged enthusiast.
Yeah, I mean, it's when we're doing the research, right? Most of this research is happening right within a lab-based setting. I mean, it's hard to go for these sessions to last more than 3 or 4 hours. So whether it's our work or the work of others, or even if you look at the historical research on this topic, whether it is just manipulating individuals pre-exercise diet or their muscle glycogen stores right pre-exercise, or obviously any kind of carbohydrate ingestion strategy during exercise. I mean, there's not many studies that go beyond, say, a 3 or 4 hour limit. So absolutely, at that point in time, right, you can go look at certain case studies, right, of individuals, doing some kind of dietary strategy, or beforehand, or again also obviously during hand. For example, our colleague in South Africa, Sean Sakonowski, he's an endurance cyclist, and so. But Sean. So if you follow him on social media, he's a interesting individual. So he has been low carb or carnivore for a long time. I don't forget how many years, and but much longer than the duration that we put people on diets for these studies, right? Just a couple of weeks, right? So he's been low carb carnivore for many years now, and he posts regularly on social media, or for example, if you follow him on Strava or something, you can see, right? So he's going out for very long duration rides. So whether it's 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, 8 hours, 9 hours, and he's doing it during the ride, he's just doing water and some electrolytes, and that's it.
Isn't that crazy?
Yes.
Yeah, but equally though, I do. You'll be familiar with Prof. Paul Lawson, I imagine, and Paul and I have spoken about how he field tests his athletes to get a sense of their fat adaptation by sort of getting them to ride up to 5 hours with just water and electrolytes, and it's that would send alarm bells ringing in most sort of sports nutritionists' sort of heads or coaches' heads. But, it's such a good way to assess how well the body can utilize other fuel sources.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that's, again, so individuals, he's not the only person. So individuals, like him, make for, great case studies to examine, substrate utilization, and maybe also, chronic adaptations. Since clear, as you can imagine, right? So for the studies especially that we have done in our lab, usually ranges somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks. And obviously there's metabolic adaptations that take place during that time period. But then you look at someone like him and others who has been low carb or carnivore for much longer, right? Years. And so there's clearly other metabolic adaptations, and that's happening, biochemical adaptations, and further enhancements in mitochondrial efficiency, and other enzymatic adaptations that must happen that allow those individuals, right, to do that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And in fact, one of the things which I've spoken to Dr. Dan Plews about quite a bit is, the fact that he was low carb and still is relatively low carb, actually, for many, many years. And he talks about how his improvements, small but noticeable for him, occurred over many years of being in that sort of metabolic nutritional state, compared to the likes of people who go on a low carb diet for 3 weeks and then try and go out and run a 10K run or walk a 10K walk or whatever. So you're right, it's and I imagine that many of these things are a little bit not immeasurable, because you can probably measure everything, but in this case study sort of arena, it's hard to pinpoint exactly.
Yeah, I mean, so there's absolutely a lack of longitudinal data. So when it comes to specifically athletes adapting to low carb diets for chronically over long periods of time, right, months or years. I mean, there's just very little data on that. I mean, Jeff Volek, they at Ohio State University, they published a study some years ago. I think it was about 2015 on those ultra endurance runners. But that was not a randomized controlled trial, right? Those are individuals who are already, habitually consuming a high carb or low carb diet. And I forget now the duration there. I think it was at least longer than 6 months or something like that.
Yeah.
Exactly. So then you look at that data specifically, I remember their muscle glycogen. So very interestingly,
Yes.
right, their muscle glycogen was not significantly different, or the muscle glycogen for the low carb athletes was not significantly different compared to the habitual high carb athletes. So is that a chronic adaptation?
Yes, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I do remember someone almost questioning Jeff Volek on the accuracy of that information or data, and I'm thinking, gosh, isn't that interesting, because it doesn't fit someone's preconceived notion of what you would expect muscle glycogen in a low carb athlete be. They're going to challenge the finding rather than sort of go,
Yeah.
oh, actually, well, that's super interesting.
Well, again, there's a lot of studies that lasted a couple days or a couple weeks where muscle glycogen, right, has been assessed, especially, right, if you go back a couple decades ago, where this all started, and with the muscle biopsy technique, right, the group of Scandinavian scientists, 1960s, right, who first came out with that. And then they started to obviously manipulate, muscle glycogen by putting people on different diets. So again, a lot of those studies, right, a couple days, and sometimes a couple weeks. And absolutely, so when you look at those studies, those individuals who are on a low carb diet, but again, it's fairly acute, right? It's fairly short term.
Yeah.
Right, their muscle glycogen, their pre-exercise muscle glycogen levels, right, were always significantly lower compared, right, to those individuals consuming obviously a more moderate or mixed diet, or obviously a high carbohydrate diet. So therefore, that warrants further investigation. Again, this topic of what are these chronic adaptations? Again, we have a pretty good idea, or at least a decent idea, of what's going on. Couple of days, couple of weeks, up to a 4 weeks, 6 weeks, etc. But once we start talking about months and years, the data is really lacking. I mean, it's just so hard to to do those studies. You got to find some really committed athletes, right, who's going to want to do this in the long term, and that's so hard because so many of them, right, have been led to believe that there's only one dietary strategy that's going to improve their performance, and obviously then you need significant funding for something like that.
Yeah, 100%. And Philip, before I sort of dive into your research, a question: is there any suggestion that if you are lower carb, that having and you adapt to that state, that you're more sensitive to carbohydrate that you take in when you exercise, or is that wishful thinking?
Remains to be determined.
Okay. Yeah, interesting.
So again,
Interesting.
so you're just at that point, right? Again, there's no real data on that. So you can find maybe certain individuals again on social media, or again maybe different case studies, but not any hard data on that, unfortunately.
Yeah, okay. Because that's an interesting question in itself. Philip,
Yeah, maybe not.
yeah.
Yeah.
What actually led you to question the idea about muscle glycogen and ingested carbohydrate are obligatory fuels for sustaining performance? Like, what even got you down this rabbit hole in the first place? I don't know if I asked you that last time.
All my degrees in academia, my undergraduate degree, master's, and Ph.D. right is in exercise science, kinesiology, and exercise physiology. Always had a passion, very deep interest also with nutrition. I've done quite a few different. Basically, all of my studies is either related to how nutrition. Whether it's diet or maybe even supplementation, right, is impacting health and performance. But from specifically talking about this specific space, low carb and high carb diets, and how it's impacting metabolism and performance, and just health in general, that started about 10 years ago or so. And kind of my interaction and collaboration with Professor Tim Noakes from South Africa. So I became interested in that topic. So about a decade ago, and mostly because of him, because of Professor Noakes's basically paradigm shift that he had. So that intrigued me a lot, or why somebody who has supported and advocated right for high carb diets for athletes, right, over such a long period of time. Why would he then change his mindset on that? And so that intrigued me, and I started to dig obviously more into the scientific literature on that topic, and I just wanted to do our own study. So this whole idea about muscle glycogen and is it essential or obligatory, right, when it comes to human exercise performance, or again this idea that fat is a more inferior, right, metabolic fuel, unable to support high intensity exercise. So there's all kinds of different reasons and explanations for why obviously the field of sports nutrition, right, has this high carbohydrate mentality, right? Or if you were to talk to athletes, and and you ask them what kind of diet does your coach or trainer, right, recommend, right? Obviously the vast majority, right, will say, well, obviously a high carbohydrate diet is needed right, to be ingested in order to optimize my sports performance. But I think very few athletes are able to articulate the actual reasons why. And obviously there's many different reasons why the field of sports nutrition, right, has this high carbohydrate mentality, whether it has to do with increased user consciousness of healthier food choices. If you think back to like the dietary guidelines and back decades ago, and this idea that fat is bad and saturated fat is bad, right? Or just the whole dietary guidelines, right? So therefore, right, or people see the food pyramid and go, well, I need to consume more fruits and vegetables and whole grains, right? Or this whole idea that fat burns in a carbohydrate flame. The whole anaplerotic theory that states that basically, in short, just goes, well, if I'm running out of glycogen, so my muscle glycogen stores become depleted. That in turn is going to result in less TCA cycle intermediates, and then therefore, as a result, it's going to impair the mitochondrial's ability to to oxidize those fatty acids, right? So therefore, fat burns in a carbohydrate flame, or whether it's all the studies over the last couple of decades showing, right, carbohydrate ingestion during exercise improves exercise performance, or the studies, or especially pivotal studies done by certain individuals showing that low carb diets impair exercise performance. These are all reasons. I think though the big ones definitely pertain to this glycogen centric view of exercise performance, and the whole crossover concept. I think, especially in my field of exercise science, right? If you look at the textbook or just kind of most of those are kind of the two big, I think, teachings. This idea that exercise intensity, right, has a big impact on energy flux, right, carbohydrate and fat oxidation. And if you're doing more higher intensity exercise, or if you progress from moderate to high intensity exercise, you're not using a lot of fat for fuel, you're using mostly, right, carbohydrates for fuel, right? Therefore, this idea that carbohydrates, right, especially because most athletes are doing more higher intensity, whether it's during training or obviously during a lot of specific competitive events, it's usually above that crossover point. So higher rates of or we would say then the exercise is carbohydrate dependent, right? The carbohydrate dependence of high intensity exercise, or this whole idea, right, that fat is a more inferior metabolic fuel. And then the whole glycogen centric view of exercise performance, like I said, that goes back decades ago by the work from Bergstrom and colleagues when they measured muscle glycogen, right, in athletes consuming either high carb diets, moderate carb diets, or low carb diets, and depending on their diet, the carbohydrate content in a diet, that obviously heavily influenced their pre-exercise muscle glycogen. So the higher the carbohydrate content in the diet, the higher the pre-exercise muscle glycogen, and therefore the greater or the longer, right, or the better the endurance exercise performance. So this kind of quote unquote link or correlation between muscle glycogen, right, and endurance exercise performance. So we're saying there that the pre-exercise muscle glycogen content seems to be determining factor when it comes to human exercise performance. But then the pre-exercise muscle glycogen content in turn is determined by the carbohydrate content, right, of the diet. Now, again, if you understand those two teachings, and I'm welcome to go into them in more detail if you want, but most people who are in this field have heard about that. So if you understand those teachings and those models or those theories, then absolutely you understand then why over the course of the last 50 years we're recommending and guiding athletes to consume obviously a lot of carbohydrates before exercise or also during exercise. And that also therefore explains at the same time why we've been recommending athletes to not consume diets that's obviously lower in carbohydrate, or obviously, as we talked about at the beginning of this, why not to consume 10 grams or 25 grams as you did right during that endurance event. But so what we've been doing over the course of the last, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years is to test these different hypotheses, right, and to challenge these different theories, these different views. And you think about it, it's really not that hard to do. Now, there seems to be a general lack of interest within the scientific community, right, to test these different hypotheses, but it's actually not that hard to do. You would just, I mean, if you want to kind of look at the first teaching, fat is a inferior metabolic fuel and able to support higher intensity exercise. Okay, just get a again group of athletes. Again, adapt them to high carb, low carb diet, for a couple of weeks, and then, do some high intensity, right, exercise event.
Exercise.
Right,
What
and then
happens?
see what happens. Because if it's true, then obviously, and in those cases, the athletes who are consuming a low carb diet, as we said also earlier on in this conversation, they're going to have obviously lower rates of carbohydrate oxidation, much higher rates of fat oxidation. But now they're doing a high intensity exercise event that's supposed to be carbohydrate dependent, so their performance should be impaired. So again, not that hard to design some kind of study to see if that is indeed true in the context, right, of a low carb athlete. Or if you,
and you've done that,
yeah, absolutely.
And other researchers have done it as well. And what astounds me actually, Philip, is the lack of acknowledgement of these studies that disprove that theory. Like even this morning, I was listening to a podcast with a very well-known sports nutritionist who was pretty adamant. Him and his exercise physiology buddy, who's now become some sort of guru in this space, saying you absolutely need carbohydrate for VO2 max above like 60% or something.
Yeah,
and I'm like,
crossover point.
It's just crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've done. We've again assessed performance. So just specifically for the more higher intensity events, or again above that crossover point, which again for most athletes, right, it's above about 65% or of their VO2 max. We've looked at maximal endurance exercise performance, or VO2 max, or time to exhaustion during a VO2 max test. We've looked at 5-kilometer running time trial performance that was performed at just over 80% VO2 max. We've looked at 1 mile time trial performance, so that was done about 90% or so of VO2 max. We've done repeated sprints. So 800 meter sprints specifically, done at about 85-86% VO2 max, but again, a whole series of them. It's basically like a repeated sprint protocol. Okay, so and none of those studies did the low carb diet impair exercise performance.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Philip, I want to, before I crack on into your latest study looking at that 10 grams of carbohydrate, can you just, I guess, dispel for us that carbohydrate, that fat burns in a carbohydrate flame? Because I do hear that a lot, and you described what that actually means. But why is that not? What do we know that actually disproves how you explained it?
Yeah, so I remember learning that right in grad school, I think. And again, it's another, right, because there are many, as I just went through a little bit ago, right. There are many different reasons and explanations for why for why we tell athletes, right, to consume high carb diets or avoid low carb diets. So again, just to summarize, the idea there, so especially during more longer duration events, that's moderate or high intensity, but not for a longer duration, because obviously in that particular context, right, you're significantly lowering or depleting, right, your muscle glycogen. And so when you're doing that, right, the idea is then therefore you're reducing glycolysis, right? So anybody who's taken an ex-phys or some kind of biochemistry course, right? So what's the input to glycolysis? Well, basically carbohydrate, right? And okay, so now my carbohydrate fuel tank, my glycogen is running low, so I have reduced glycolysis. Now I have reduced pyruvate that comes from glycolysis, and then therefore as a result, I have reduced these Krebs cycle intermediates, right? These products within the TCA cycle that basically keep it going and functioning. And therefore, as a result, now we're saying, well, it doesn't matter how much fat you have to burn. It doesn't matter that you have this enormous amount of energy coming from fat. If it's 50, 60, 70, 80,000 kilocalories coming from your fat stores, fat also burns, right, in a carbohydrate flame, meaning, fat also gets oxidized, right, within the Krebs cycle, within the TCA cycle. So that's that particular theory. But again, doesn't seem to not all the facts seem to line up, right? Because if that, just think about it, right? So if that is indeed true, and I was we're actually talking about this in my ex-phys class the other day. Like if that's indeed true, think about it. So now you get an athlete, right, who's on a low carb diet. That individual's, again, muscle glycogen is obviously now significantly lower compared to what it is on a high carb diet. So again, we can test this. It's not that hard.
Yeah.
Put the athlete on a low carb diet, and now say, okay, well, do some kind of endurance event. According to that theory, that athlete's endurance exercise performance should be significantly impaired because now they start out the exercise with much lower levels of glycogen within their muscle, which means, it shouldn't take that long for them now to deplete the glycogen that's in their muscle. And now, again, doesn't matter the fact that this person is such an incredible fat burner, right? All the fat, right, also has to get oxidized, right, or go to the Krebs cycle. So therefore, again, clearly there should be an impairment in exercise or in endurance exercise performance. But when you go look at the studies, or again the one that we'll talk about next, because we've also looked. We haven't just looked at the more shorter duration, higher intensity exercise performance, but we also looked at endurance exercise performance. And again, no difference there, no impairment in performance either. So maybe that applies to athletes consuming a high carb diet, but it doesn't seem to apply to athletes consuming a low carb diet.
Yeah. And so, Philip, you mentioned earlier actually that there were reasons for you choosing the 10 grams of carbohydrate an hour, which did seem like super tiny. How did you arrive at that number?
Okay. Yeah. So, so maybe, for that study, just to maybe even back it up a little bit.
Yes, please.
And again, if anybody's interested or want to go, read the actual study, I mean, that was published in the American Journal of Physiology not that long ago, and you can find it.
I'll pop it in the show notes.
Okay, yes,
yeah.
that will be good. But yeah, so we wanted to, after doing a whole series of studies, right, that was more shorter in duration, lasting basically anywhere from a couple of minutes to about 15, 20 minutes, right, for the 5K stuff. We wanted to do something more obviously longer in duration. And again, the idea is that there should be a clear difference. There should be a clear difference. Specifically, sure, this anaplerotic theory or fat burns in a carbohydrate flame, or again, just back to this idea about, well, muscle glycogen. It's all about how much glycogen, right, is within your muscle, and once that reaches a certain point, right, during exercise where it's very low, right, you're going to bonk, you're going to hit the wall, right. Those feelings of fatigue, right, your RPE is going to be going way up, or your affect's going to be going way down. So therefore, you're going to slow down or stop. Therefore, as a result. and again, just just say everybody can understand. So if you're on a low carb diet, usually just for a couple of weeks, again, maybe there's evidence for maybe some kind of chronic adaptation where your muscle glycogen, right, is not lower, but for the most part, the majority of the evidence says that it is. So especially in the time course that we're studying it, right, a couple of weeks. So if you just think about it, right, my muscle glycogen is lower. I'm starting the exercise compared to athletes who are starting the exercise where their pre-exercise muscle glycogen is much higher because they're consuming a much higher carbohydrate-based diet. So therefore, as a result, now during exercise, maybe after the first hour or so, right, of performing exercise, now my muscle glycogen has now hit a low or very low level, and therefore, again, according to that belief that muscle glycogen is obligatory or plays some kind of causal role, right, in fatigue, then absolutely you should see a significant difference, right, in those athletes consuming the low carb diet and high carb diet when it comes to endurance exercise performance. But again, that's why we do research. So in this particular study, we got a group of triathletes. Obviously, they're all doing the Ironman, right, triathlon. So these are individuals with a very high, right, training volume. They're biking a lot, they're swimming a lot, they're running a lot, etc. So we put them, so it's for 6 weeks. So 6 weeks duration, high carb, low carb. It's a crossover design, right? So each person in the study undergoes each intervention, and that was randomized. Now,
so can I just ask, Philip, was it 6 weeks on the high carb, washout,
yes,
6 weeks on the low carb?
Exactly. And then just the order was mixed up, right? We randomized that.
Okay, and then 6 weeks, was that just to ensure that actually these athletes were going to be well adapted to their dietary intervention?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas there are some questions if you only put someone on a diet for, say, 2 weeks, whether or not that's enough time. So is that why you were like, look, let's just be super safe, do it 6 weeks?
Yeah, so based on our previous studies, we've shown that, that range, 4 to 6 weeks, or at least 4 weeks, right, is sufficient to not, right, impair exercise performance. So therefore, that particular, kind of, study duration.
And can you just remind us, when you say LCHF or low carb, are we talking about under 50 grams of carbohydrate a day?
Yep.
Protein consistent across diets? And so how did that look?
Yeah, so from a dietary standpoint, when they are on the low carb diet, so specifically they're consuming a ketogenic diet, so less than 50 grams per day. If you go look at there's a table in that study where you can go find all the kind of the averages, the 6 week averages for the low carb and high carb diet. But yeah, so when they were on the low carb or the ketogenic diet, they were consuming on average about 40 grams of carbohydrates per day, compared to when they were on the high carbohydrate diet, they were consuming on average about 400 grams of carbohydrate per day. So kind of a big difference there in overall, carbohydrate. So basically, on the low carb, from a percentage standpoint, less than 10%, and between about on the low ketogenic, and about 60-70% of carbohydrate on the high carb diet.
So if I'm thinking 400 grams of carbs, that might be 6 or 7 grams per kg body weight, or
Mm-hmm.
or at least over 5 grams per kg body weight for these particular sort of athletes.
Yeah, but either way, significant difference, like only about like a 400 gram difference in the amount of carbohydrate, right, that's being ingested on a daily basis with that. So again, think how that will influence specifically, right, muscle glycogen. I'm only consuming 40 grams versus I'm consuming 400 grams per day.
Isocaloric, so were the calories the same? So if there was a weight bump in the high carb diet, that will just be because they were storing more glycogen and more water. So it wasn't like that like no one gained or lost weight on those.
Yeah, so it was it's isocaloric. So it was just, I think it was like 2,500 or so, kcals per day.
Yeah.
But yeah, we try our best. Obviously, this is hard to do in these studies to control for obviously confounding variables. So making sure, okay, the overall total calorie amount is roughly the same, or for example, training volume. Obviously, if there's any significant changes in that can impact performance. So by controlling calories, by controlling training volume, or for the most part even body composition. So obviously you don't want to see big changes in there. You're looking at the end of the day, right? What we're interested in is diet-induced effects.
Yeah.
Right. That's why we do these studies, right? We want to see how diet ultimately is impacting performance, not some other variable. So,
any diet adherence issues, like, or so the low carb, or the ketogenic, they were in ketosis, and I mean. Hey, if someone can eat 400 grams of carb, I mean, that is a feat within itself. But I mean,
yeah. So we have a nutritionist that works with each athlete or each participant in the study. So there's education and sessions, familiarization, orientation, right? That happens before the start of each diet. We use for that study, we use MyFitnessPal, right? It's just easy, it's convenient, right? People have the app on their phone, and then they log their dietary intake at least 3 days per week. However, most of these individuals like doing it on a much regular basis.
Triathletes for you.
Yeah, so they do that. The nutritionist, right, is so because at the end of each week, right, we put the data into the system. The nutritionist or the dietitian is looking at that or making any adjustments if adjustments, right, are needed. Then there's also we give each participant the little blood ketone meter, so they're measuring. Obviously, on the low carb diet, they're measuring their blood ketones a couple days per week. Also, for that study, we did CGM, so continuous glucose monitoring, right? And I have access to the platform, and that was through Super Sapiens, which has since gone out of business. But in any case, but we have right. So they give access to the platform, and so I can see each participant their daily values. So it's if somebody were to cheat, right? Well, so meaning
you would
there's
see it.
Yeah, whether it's the dietitian is seeing it, or I'm seeing different, or I'm not seeing significant elevations in their blood ketones, or obviously if they have the sensor on, right, and they're in a low carb diet and their blood glucose is going right all over the place, or significant elevations, right? So we can see it. So that's kind of our way to make sure and adherence, because we have those systems and protocols in place. Adherence to the diets is always good.
Yeah, nice one. Did you measure muscle? Do you do muscle biopsies on the glycogen,
No,
Philip?
no. So unfortunately, we did not. That is obviously a little bit more challenging. You don't see a lot of people do that these days, anymore. Just because obviously it is an invasive procedure, and if you are going to do it, obviously you're going to have individuals or participants who are willing to have a little hole in their leg before right before they start to exercise. But then also after, you have to do it after exercise as well, right? Because it's pre-exercise, and then or measured again, right, at the point of exhaustion. And subject recruitment for these studies are already significantly challenging, and so you don't want to introduce another variable. So therefore, you look at you look at other studies, similar in duration, and you look at the muscle glycogen and what's assessed in that. So sure, no study is perfect, and we're not saying our studies are perfect, and that is a limitation, right? That we did not directly measure glycogen. However, based on obviously other previous studies of similar protocols and similar duration on low carb, there should have been a pretty significant and stark difference there.
Yeah, sure. So, Philip, do you want to chat through what you found, or what you did actually, and what you found beyond the diet intervention?
So, low carb, high carb, 6 weeks, and so what you're looking there is again, how does the pre-exercise diet impacting in this case endurance exercise performance? And so for endurance exercise performance, we did a time to exhaustion trial. So these athletes were on a bike, and they were going at about 70% again off their VO2 max to exhaustion. And so if you're for those who are unfamiliar with it, a time to exhaustion is just pretty similar, right? So we calculate a power output that corresponds with that VO2 max range. And then basically you're just holding, right, that workload until you can't hold that workload any longer. And then that's it. That's your time to exhaustion, right? And so that was one part of this study. How does the pre-exercise diet impact endurance exercise performance?
And so that in that particular trial, it was time to exhaustion, and there was no carbohydrate ingested during that challenge?
So that's one aspect of the study. The other aspect of the study was then carbohydrate ingestion during those sessions.
Yeah, okay.
So when they're on the low carb diet or high carb diet, during those time to exhaustion sessions, they either received a placebo or again the carbohydrate, but again the 10 grams per hour.
Yeah.
So again, there's different elements of the study here, right? Basically, what we're trying to it was not many. This is the first study I think that was designed in such a way to get an idea of is it muscle glycogen depletion that's causing fatigue, right? Or is the principal driver of fatigue, or is it something else, right? Is it more or is it exercise induced hypoglycemia? And we can talk more about the history of that later on if you want. So that's how the study was designed, because if you think about it, if there's no if the pre-exercise diet, right, low carb or high carb, and again that's having significant alterations in muscle glycogen, if we're seeing no differences in exercise performance there, well then you would step back and go, well, how's muscle glycogen
At all
then obligatory, right? Or exactly, how is it so essential? How's it having such a significant impact on performance if we're feeding people 40 grams versus 400 grams of carbohydrates on a daily basis, right? And we're seeing no significant difference in time to exhaustion, and that's exactly what happened. There was no significant difference there. But then the other thing we did is again the carbohydrate ingestion strategy during exercise, and participants were blinded. They didn't know what they're getting, right? So it was every 20 minutes. That was the protocol that we did. So every 20 minutes during the time to exhaustion, right? It's either, right, here's a basically just flavored water, or here is a very small amount of carbohydrate. Now, in that case, it averaged out to be about 3 grams every 20 minutes. So it comes out to about 10 grams per hour. So again, a lot of pilot testing went into that beforehand, because we wanted to choose a carbohydrate ingestion strategy that would not significantly have any impacts on metabolism, right? Because that's usually what, again, as we talked about previously, absolutely, once the carbohydrate intake during exercise is higher, right, then you're going to see some big shifts there, right, in carbohydrate and fat oxidation. So based upon our previous pilot work, it was shown that, okay, this is having very minimal impacts on metabolism during exercise. And so now, right, so the idea there is this small amount is going to have a minimal impact on substrate metabolism during exercise. And this minimum amount, will it be sufficient, right? Because the idea is that this will help to maintain blood glucose concentrations during exercise. It will help to mitigate hypoglycemia during exercise. Based on this idea, right, you only have a very small amount of glucose, right, in your bloodstream. It's only about 4 or 5 grams of glucose, right, in 5 liters of blood. So again, that was the other idea behind this 10 grams per hour, right? What would be a small enough amount that would not impact significantly substrate metabolism, but would be at the same time be sufficient to help maintain, right, glycemia, help maintain blood glucose concentrations during exercise, and that's where we did see a difference.
Okay, so can I ask a couple of questions? One, what type of carbohydrate were they ingesting? Was it
Yep.
maltodextrin, glucose, or and my other question is actually answer that first.
Yes, it was the first one you mentioned. It was maltodextrin. Yeah.
Okay, maltodextrin, yeah, and then is the strategy, this sort of 10 grams or the titration of very small amounts of carbohydrate, is that very similar to the carbohydrate rinsing strategies that we've seen being used in other studies that look at the impact of very small amounts of carbohydrate on the brain and work output? And I believe these were studies done in cyclists maybe
Yeah,
10 or 15 years ago.
yeah, maybe there's some. Well, I can imagine. Obviously, there's some differences and similarities. As well as we're. Well, again, I haven't personally done any carbohydrate rinsing studies, but again, interesting how you have seen performance benefits, right, of just rinsing with carbohydrate, right, during some of these events and seeing improvement, right. So obviously indications there of some kind of central, right, brain mechanism.
Yeah.
Now with what we're doing, right, is more geared towards the small glucose pool, right? The amount of glucose in your bloodstream, within your circulation, within your liver. Because sure, once your blood glucose starts to go down, right? I mean, clinical hypoglycemia is below 70 milligrams per deciliter, right? The person's going to start to experience, right, symptoms of fatigue, right? Because and again, so that's why I'm saying there is similarities there, going back to the central or brain mechanism, right? Because your brain is trying to prevent glycopenic brain damage from occurring, right? If there's insufficient right amount of glucose going to the brain. So this goes back to, for example, Professor Noakes's right central governor model, right, of fatigue. The brain is is kind of preventing that damage from occurring. So therefore, as a result, right, you start to experience more and more, right, greater symptoms of discomfort and off fatigue. Now, historically, right, we would say, well, that's because your muscle glycogen has hit very low levels. But again, there's evidence, as we have shown in this study, because this study was specifically developed to kind of single out those two. And what we have found, right, in that other part of the study is there was a big difference in performance. So independent of diet. So it didn't matter if it was subjects were on a high carb diet or low carb diet. When they ingested this very minimal amount of carbohydrate during exercise, they saw about a 20% improvement in performance. Because you can see, if you go look at the blood glucose values, again, it's in the paper, there's a big difference in the post exercise. So the point of fatigue, right? That point where, like, okay, I can't maintain this power output anymore. Right? Well, we measured blood glucose immediately post exercise, and there's about a 20 milligram per deciliter difference compared to when they were ingesting, right, again, only minimal, only 10 grams per hour compared to obviously zero, right, or just flavored water. So absolutely, again, evidence that it's rather exercise-induced hypoglycemia that seems to be a principal driver of fatigue, not so much muscle glycogen depletion. And that, so just for anybody listening to this, once you understand that, there are significant implications of that knowledge, and we can talk more about that.
Yeah, let's talk about them.
Yeah.
Like what are these implications?
Yes, absolutely. So again, remember, first off, we've shown now in a couple different studies that the pre-exercise diet, it doesn't seem to impact exercise performance, right? High carb, low carb, whether it's more shorter duration, more middle duration, or long duration. Again, if there was a difference, if all these theories or teachings are correct, I should have, in all of these studies, we should have seen a clear difference. Never any difference. Okay, so it doesn't seem that pre-exercise diet seems to be a determining factor when it comes to exercise performance. So sure, it's impacting muscle glycogen, but it doesn't seem that whether it's high or low doesn't seem to be have any meaningful difference when it comes to exercise performance. I mean, if you even think about one of the previous studies we did, just very quickly, we did repeated sprints, 800-meter sprints. That's a glycogen depleting protocol where we did 6 of them.
Yeah.
That's
Whoa.
again,
Yeah.
because you can deplete your glycogen in this example that I just cited. That's okay. It's longer duration, but you can also deplete it very quickly by doing very high intensity exercise, right? Doing multiple sets, and that was kind of the purpose of doing that, right? Because the idea is, but now the subjects are on a low carb diet. They're coming in. That was only 4-week study. They're coming in with low levels of glycogen in the muscle. So maybe here by the third or fourth set, right? Oh, their
Yeah.
glycogen is now going to hit
Depleted.
very low levels, right? Because intensity is such a big factor, right? That really accelerates glycogen usage and depletion, right? Accelerated glycolysis and obviously glycogenolysis taking place within the muscle. And so that was the idea behind that protocol. But again, that didn't happen. You go look at performance for the 800-meter sprints, for all 6 sets. So no difference there. Actually, in that study, we measured the higher rates of fat oxidation ever recorded. So very high rates of obviously fat oxidation that humans can achieve on that diet, even at high exercise intensities. But in any case, I digress. So the point there is we've done multiple studies. Obviously, others have as well, just showing that the pre-exercise diet seems to have a minimal impact on exercise performance. So that's valuable information because then you can choose for yourself, right? It's not just this kind of
You must be low carb or you must be high carb. It's like, hey, what do you prefer?
Yeah, or obviously just from a historical perspective, you must consume a high carb diet, right, in order to optimize your performance. So this kind of one size fits all protocol. Because the other thing, right, again, this obviously also helpful information for any listeners is in all of these studies, yes, there are individual differences, as you can imagine. So you have to just, when you look at these studies and you look at you're looking at the means, right? You're looking at the averages. Oh, there was no difference in 1 mile time trial performance or time to exhaustion, 5K, whatever. You're looking at the means. But what you don't see is the usually like the individual performances and how one person did better on the higher carb diet and how the other person did better on the low carb diet. So, for example, the study I was just referring to, the time to exhaustion, there was 10 subjects in that study. Guess what?
Mm-hmm.
5 did better on the high carb diet. 5 did better on the low carb diet. So it was actually an equal split. So that's obviously just something that everybody can test out for themselves because there is those individual differences. However, maybe as we discuss later, but obviously the health implications should be considered of those dietary choices as well. So there's dietary implications of that. However, the other big implication is if we're saying that it's hypoglycemia, right? Exercise-induced hypoglycemia is more closely related to fatigue or what we refer to as bonking, right, or hitting the wall, and not so much glycogen depletion. That has significant dietary implications as well, right? Because if you go with the traditional view that it's all about glycogen, right? Muscle glycogen is obligatory; it's essential for human exercise performance and metabolism. Then absolutely, you would ingest large amounts before exercise, right, to stuff your muscle with as much carbohydrate or glycogen as possible. Again, you would ingest a large amounts during, right, to prevent glycogen or to spare it, right, which doesn't seem to be the case either, as we previously discussed. Okay, but the other one, if we're saying no, it's rather to do with drops in blood glucose levels. Well, look what we did in this study, right? It was only a very small, because you only need a very small amount of carbohydrate to help prevent or mitigate, right, hypoglycemia. So therefore, right, again, the current recommendations up to 120 grams per hour, but we showed obviously just a minimal amount, right? 10 grams per hour is sufficient to do that as well. So if you're following our research, basically there's significant dietary ramifications as it pertains to the diet that's consumed before exercise, but also the dietary strategies during exercise.
Yeah. Philip, like at 70% VO2 max, like, do you think that your findings at that intensity is applicable to, say, a marathon runner? Like, I'm thinking about myself running a marathon at potentially higher intensity. Like, do you think that the same theory would still hold?
Yeah, I mean, we think it would. Again, we obviously the subjects we chose in our studies, or that particular one, right, was triathletes, and I mean that's a multimodal, right, type of activity. So it goes, swimming, biking, and running. So we think, I would speculate that the results obviously goes to other, right, endurance sports as well. Now, in terms of the actual intensity, right, that was about average out to be about 70% of VO2 max. Now, obviously, understandably, depending on the event and the athlete, right, some individuals are able to maybe hold, right, 75%, 80%, right, VO2 max. So that would the intensity matter? Well, I don't know, because then when we look at some of the other studies we've done where on that crossover concept, and we have shown that athletes who are on a low carb diet, the crossover point occurred at 85% of their VO2 max, meaning
Yeah,
at that
yeah.
intensity. That's 85%. I think that's pretty high intensity.
It
Right?
totally is.
That was the
Yeah.
crossover point, meaning so at that point, 50% of the energy was coming from carbs, 50% of the energy was coming from fat. So again, those who are on a low carb diet, just know that you are shifting that crossover point to the right, and you are using a significant amount of fats for fuel, even right at those higher exercise intensity. Now, obviously, for those who are doing, like you're saying, a marathon. But the longer duration, obviously, the intensity is going to start dropping significantly. So I don't think it's an issue there. It would still just be about, especially during those long duration events, ensuring you are supplementing, obviously, with some form of carbohydrate. But again, to maintain your blood glucose concentrations.
Yeah, okay. So, and I guess this is the thing, right? It's that is 10 grams an hour going to be enough to maintain that blood glucose concentration? But to your point, we've got it's circulating amounts of 4 grams and 5 liters of blood. It actually should. Like, I'm quite keen to even look at, because we've got a marathon coming up actually in a few weeks' time. It would be interesting to sort of test the 10 gram theory and just see what happens, because you've got nothing to lose, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, people can test it out, right? For example, during during training, right, going on a long run
Yeah.
or bike or something like that, and see right and see how they do, right? If you're doing if you're used to 60, 90, or obviously any of these higher amounts, yeah, well, how would you do right on much lower amounts, right? Again, so we just did 10 now. What's missing in this field is proper dosing studies.
Yeah,
Proper
like
dosing, dose
testing different
response.
levels,
Yes,
right?
you would
Yeah,
think that
yeah.
there would be more. They are not.
Mhm.
There hasn't been a lot of very well controlled studies where they say, okay, well, how does 10 grams compare to 60 grams, compared to 90 grams, compared to 120, whatever? And that's actually where our research is going. So anybody who is interested, now obviously it's going to take a while to finish that. So, I would say in a 2 to 3 year time period, we should have a sufficient amount of data on high carb athletes and low carb athletes. Because if you think about it, right, there's kind of two different states. So, for example, if you're an athlete adapted to a high carb diet, what does it look like for my performance doing 10 grams per hour versus 60 grams per hour versus 90 grams per hour? But then how
Mm.
does that look like? Is that any different for a low carb athlete doing 10 versus 60 versus 90? Because you can
Yeah,
imagine
yeah.
the responses might be different there, and so we're planning to do those dose response studies, and we're planning to do them in high carb athletes and also fat adapted athletes, and so we'll have
Nice.
answers to those questions.
And I also like, just to throw another, not spanner in the works, but think about it, like, because you're looking at specifically like ketogenic athletes, whereas you've got the likes of, let's say, Hubster and I, and we have our diets were probably more in the realms of 100 to 120 grams, so still fairly low carb. Like less than maybe 25% of our calories are coming from carbohydrate, but not in that ketogenic space. Like, I wonder if there's a difference there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would go back to just kind of what I said previously. I mean, it would seem that pre-exercise diet has a minimal impact on performance.
Yeah,
Now, in
yeah,
your
good
case,
point. Good
your
point.
carb intake is still on the lower end, right? You're not doing 400, 500, 600, or some of these elite athletes doing like a kilogram, right?
I heard that on a podcast this morning as well. I went, whoa, that's a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you obviously still have higher rates, right, of fat oxidation. That's obviously will be beneficial, especially during obviously those longer duration events. So again, I would go back to that point, that the pre-exercise diet is probably having very minimal impacts, and rather maybe focus on what's being ingested during exercise. Yeah.
Yeah. And I feel, and to your point about the health ramifications, and I'm mindful of your time, so I don't want to keep you too long, Philip. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Because, of course, just over in the last couple of weeks, the internet seems to have blown up over Lionel Sanders' realization that his really terrible shit diet that he really championed for years and years has finally, he finally got blood work done to show all of these symptoms were pre-diabetes that he was experiencing because of that. So, I mean, it really does blow my mind that athletes think that they can get away with it, actually. Yeah. And, I mean, this was just one very public example that a lot of us can't.
Again, thanks for bringing that up, right? Because again, that's been something that's been, if you're in this space, right, the nutritional space on social media, you've seen a lot of chatter recently about Lionel Sanders, right, coming out, obviously elite triathlete, and I'm pre-diabetic. I don't want to die of diabetes. But if you go look at some of those videos, again, his carb intake was enormous. Like he was at about I think he said like a kilogram, like basically per day. But so that's not unusual for these elite endurance or ultra endurance athletes to be consuming such a large amount, right? Such a large amount of carbohydrate on a daily basis. And as he admits, right, it's coming, a lot of the carbohydrate just coming from junk food, right? These ultra processed foods, a lot of just sweets and candies, etc. So, kudos to him for coming out, for being brave enough to say that and express that. There's clearly a lot more, whether it's recreational athletes, semi-pro athletes, or obviously in this case also professional athletes, whose health is being significantly impaired via this diet. So that's why I'm saying, like, it's the pre-exercise diet is not significantly impacting exercise performance. Okay.
But that's one aspect.
But exactly. So you can't just when you're doing when you're testing this stuff out, you're doing the N of one experiments, right? It's not just about the performance aspects, but also about the health aspects as well, right? So when I was on when we were chatting, I think was it last year?
Just 18 months ago or so.
Then we were talking a lot about that previous study, because we found that in endurance athletes, in that study, it was mostly, it was runners, but also cyclists, triathletes, right, marathon runners. 30%, right, were pre-diabetic on the high carb diet. Nobody on the low carb diet, right, were pre-diabetic, but on the high carb diet, right, on the traditional diet. So again, think about it. So despite all the training, despite those high training loads, and that was just in our study. I can't imagine. I mean, the training load of Lionel Sanders, right? The amount of training that goes into that. So despite all that exercise, still developing features, right, of prediabetes. And we did publish also. I think it was last year or the year before, kind of a review article that kind of dealt with the crossover concept, but also this topic, right, of blood glucose and dysregulation and prediabetes. And again, so there are some other studies. There's not a lot of studies on this, right? For example, we've done CGM on athletes over a course of a couple of weeks. So some studies have actually found that number to be higher than 30%. Some of them have found it to be lower than 30%. What we do know is that a certain percentage, clearly, of athletes are developing features, right, of prediabetes, and just overall their cardiometabolic health is impaired.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of the chatter on X about it, and people are arguing that his symptoms or his poor health or blood glucose was as a result of, or his improvements, sorry, because now he's finally sleeping, so it's not the carbohydrate. Because of course, one of the features of prediabetes is having to get up to go to the bathroom several times a night, so you can't sleep. And I'm like, well, it's not yes, the sleep improved, and obviously that's going to improve his performance, but the sleep only improved because he changed his diet.
Yeah, I mean, your kidneys has to work overtime to filter and excrete all that excess sugar, right?
Yeah, I know. And he is still eating carbohydrate, but he's making I didn't see any information on how much carbohydrate he's eating now compared to sort of what he was eating, but he was talking about doing something like having a full-on carbohydrate breakfast, then doing a super easy ride, but still consuming carbohydrate during that ride, and then consuming carbohydrate after the ride, and these are habits that a lot of triathletes do use, particularly if they're lean, because I feel like athletes who might struggle a little bit with body composition have probably more awareness of the impact of carbohydrate for that reason, and are probably a little bit lower, at least in my clinical experience. Whereas I get a lot of athletes who tend to, quote unquote, get away with it. So they're just like chowing down all the time.
Yeah, and guess how long can you get away with it? Right, because
Exactly.
what happens when your training load, right, starts to go down? Because again, we know exercise obviously helps to improve, right, insulin sensitivity, right. And I mean, you have when you look at the mechanism, right, you have that insulin dependent, but then you also have that insulin independent, right, mechanism, right, of GLUT4 activation or translocation,
Yeah.
and that's exercise, right? Exercise or muscle contraction, right, independently of insulin action, causes the activation and translocation of those glucose transporters. But now, right, what happens later on, right, when the person is not training so vigorously, so heavy anymore, right? So, with and still consuming obviously a high carbohydrate diet would how would the person's long-term health then be implicated by that?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's why I asked you the question much earlier on, just about that insulin response during exercise. Because I mean, to be fair, I haven't really looked at it that hard, but I was just under the assumption that didn't really use insulin during exercise because we had these independent sort of
Yeah, I mean,
pathways. But
usually
clearly
the
wrong.
plasma insulin concentrations during exercise go down, right?
Yeah,
But obviously,
yeah,
if I'm gonna that response is gonna look different, right? If I'm just exercising without ingesting anything, right?
yeah.
Or I'm doing
90 grams.
exactly big difference there.
Yeah, Philip. And I guess one of my final questions is on sex differences. Like, do we expect this to be different in females versus males? Like, are there any mechanisms that would suggest there are?
Maybe not. Again, it's unfortunate that almost all of the research in this field is done on males. So yeah, sorry, I don't have a good answer to that question. Again, um, maybe not. It's just so hard to tell. And again, it is unfortunate that there are not more people interested in doing this work or research. So if you think about all this stuff or the work that we've been talking about, there's not a lot of labs just in the U.S., right, who's doing the research, right? Our lab here at Grove City College, Jeff Volek's lab at the Ohio State University, and then it's like, okay, well, who else is interested in doing it? But yes, absolutely. That's much more needs to be explored within this realm. Like I told you, kind of where more my interest or kind of future direction, right, is going at. So now that we have kind of moved away from muscle glycogen, let's rather look at carbohydrate ingestion during exercise and different dosing strategies. So yeah, that's just one little niche area that we need to study and investigate. But again, there's so many, right? There's so many. You're mentioning one. Are there gender differences, right? So people should investigate that, right? Or what about recovery? Well, how's training load or volume impacted, right? How's immune function impacted? How's kind of muscle coordination, or during sports like tennis or cricket, right? Kind of more fine motor, right? Activities. How's that impacted by carbohydrate restriction? So many more
So
areas
much.
to explore. So we just need more people to actually be interested and invested in this.
Yeah, no, I love it, Philip. Thank you so much for your time, your afternoon,
Yeah.
my morning. Like, I loved doing this deep dive into it because it's an area that fascinates me because I know so many low carb athletes who are absolutely fine. I know so many athletes, male and female, that go out with not a lot of fuel. They're actually absolutely fine. Whereas like what I see clinically doesn't always marry up to what you see in the literature at all until now with the sort of emergence of the research that you guys are doing. So thank you so much
Absolutely.
for that.
And go check again. Stay. Again, you're welcome to follow me on or whoever's interested on social media, or goes or ResearchGate and go read some of the studies. But definitely stay tuned because we have some great work coming up. Or there's a very massive or big review article that hopefully gets published sometime by the end of this year, that investigates the last 100 years of research on this topic and evaluates over 150 studies on this topic. Right, this whole idea, especially as it pertains to this small glucose pool, right? The amount of glucose in your bloodstream and the liver compared to obviously the much larger glucose pool, right? The glucose, the glycogen stored within your muscle. So it will provide a great historical context, right? So anybody interested in the history, because like I said, we go back. I mean, the last 100 years. It's very interesting, right? How the
Yeah.
science evolved from like their studies you can go find in the 1930s, where people were again the Scandinavians were doing some really excellent work, or exercising for a prolonged period of time, seeing hypoglycemia develop, experiencing symptoms of fatigue, ingesting carbohydrates at that point, being able then to exercise, right, for more prolonged periods of time once the hypoglycemia is being eliminated. But then how that unfortunately kind of went away once the whole muscle biopsy technique, right, was developed in the 1960s, and then how most of the focus just kind of then shifted kind of away from exercise-induced hypoglycemia, right, as a principal cause of fatigue. Then the in thing, right, became muscle glycogen and being able to measure muscle glycogen, and just that relationship between muscle glycogen and fatigue. But again, the last thing I would say is very interesting. If anybody wants to go look up, that there's a 1967 study by Bergstrom and colleagues. That
Yes.
pivotal study, right? And everybody
Yep.
always cites, and that was really kind of the whole start to this iconic and novel idea about muscle glycogen and its role in human exercise performance. You know what? They did measure blood glucose as well. It's just that
Oh, did
people
they?
overlook that.
Oh,
Right? It's just that,
interesting.
look at this
Yeah.
perfect correlation between pre-exercise muscle glycogen and fatigue, right? It's such a strong positive relationship between those variables, and how diet impacted that, right? But they measured blood glucose. And if you go look on because there was 3 trials, right? It was the 3 different
Yeah.
diets: low carb, moderate, and then high. In all 3 trials, significant hypoglycemia developed because that was also time to exhaustion at, I think, 75% VO2 max. So it was there. It was hypoglycemia has always been there. When you look at all of these trials, that is, where the exercise duration is longer than an hour, or at least 2 or 3 hours in duration. Sure, the ones that measured muscle glycogen, right? So you'll see, sure, muscle glycogen is low, but blood glucose, right, is also low. And then you go look at some of these other studies, like I know Ed Coyle did one, and I think that was in the 80s, and it was like some really exceptional endurance athletes. These guys were doing either carbohydrate ingestion or placebo. And when they got the placebo, they ran for 3 hours. They did the carbohydrate ingestion, they did for 4 hours. So they ran an hour more just by doing, in that case, it was like 100 grams per hour. But then you go look at their muscle glycogen. The point of exhaustion, right? Again,
wasn't related
3 hours
to
or 4 hours, right? That was the same. So their muscle glycogen was basically, identical. So then you go, well, studies like that, just kind of like our own one, like, well, how can muscle glycogen, right, be responsible or be directly kind of a causal agent there of fatigue, right? But then you go look at the data for the blood glucose and you see, when they were ingesting the placebo, right, their blood glucose was starting to do this, right? They were starting to go down, quite significantly. So that's the or seems to be rather the driver of fatigue, or one of the drivers, obviously, of fatigue for these endurance events. So that's kind of a little snippet, a little preamble there to the big review. Yeah. But again, it's a lot of work went into that, and again, Professor Tim Noakes kind of drove that effort, and so it should be a game changer when it hopefully comes out sometime later this year.
Well, Philip, I would love to get you back on to chat about it when it is published, because that sounds amazing. And of course, I will put links to your ResearchGate. I will hunt down that 1960s trial, because I'm sort of interested myself. Pop that in the show notes as well. And of course, a separate link to the study that we focused on today too.
Sounds good.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all of the work that you do, and also for taking the time to share it with us, because the thing is that people will continue to repeat what they think is true, because there aren't enough of these conversations happening.
Absolutely.
So I love that you see how important it is that we do it as well with the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thanks for having me on.
Nice. Thanks for that.
All right, hopefully you enjoyed that as much as I did, and I'm super looking forward to that review that Philip and I were discussing that hopefully is due out later this year. The fact that it's a game changer for how we think about sports nutrition is huge. But fundamentally, there are so many trials that have now been published that really challenge these conventional views. And Plews is really big in this space, Paul Lawson. There are just a whole bunch of people. So it's really great to chat to the people who are really sort of current in their information around sports nutrition and also care about metabolic health. So next week on the podcast, speaking of challenging conventional thinking, I have the pleasure of chatting to Nina Tykolch all about the dietary guidelines and just diet in general. Super great conversation. Until then, though, you can catch me over on Instagram, X, and Threads at Mikki Williden, Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, or head to my website, mikkiwilliden.com. All right, team, you have the best week. See you later.